Once again, today we're going to be talking about currency exchange. We're going to be talking about buying rates and selling rates. Remember to think from the bank's perspective. If you are selling a foreign currency, then the bank is buying. You would use the buying rate. If you are buying a foreign currency, then the bank would be selling that to you. You would use the bank's selling rate. Okay. The first example is as follows, and you have this on your sheet. This is a question that will show up on your test, possibly an exam. It says on a specific date, the selling rate for China's yuan compared to the Canadian dollar is 0.162600, and the buying rate is 0.127100. How many yuan will you receive for 1,000 Canadian dollars? To answer this question, we are going to say let X equal the amount of what? What is it we're trying to buy? We want the foreign currency. So start with that. And remember your proportion. It's 1 over. Now, if I'm trying to buy the foreign currency, which rate should I put under the 1? What's the bank doing if I'm buying the foreign currency? The bank is selling. So it's 1 over the selling rate in this case. And it's going to equal the foreign amount over the Canadian amount. So when I fill in the proportion, I am going to use 1 over which of these numbers up in the problem represent the selling rate. The first decimal. The selling rate is this number right here, 0.1626 with a couple of trailing zeros. It equals, do I have the foreign amount? No, so I'm putting X on top of, how many Canadian dollars do I have in this question? 1,000. And then like all our other problems, I'm going to cross multiply. I'll start with the X. I'll multiply it by the decimal. That would give me 0.162600X. Write your equal sign. 1,000 times 1 is 1,000. And then what would you do from here? Divide both sides. And you don't have to show this, that I'm dividing. You could just say X equals. I show it so that when you go home and look, you can see what I did. On this side, the decimals would divide away. That would equal 1. And I'm left with 1,000 divided by 0.1626. And what does that give me? 6,150.06 Chinese yuan. Okay? Everyone all right with that? Ready to move on to part 2 of the question? Trip gets canceled. Okay, on the same day as the previous example, if after purchasing your yuan, you decided not to go to China, something came up, something obviously big if you have to cancel a trip to China. And then you go to the bank, you've got your Chinese currency, you don't want it, it's no good to you here in Canada, so you sell it back to the bank. And you want to figure out how many Canadian dollars you're going to get back. If I'm selling the foreign currency back to the bank, what is the bank doing? Okay? They actually want to know how much money I would lose in this transaction. Like, I don't just take that amount of yuan back to the bank and get my 1,000 Canadian dollars back. Okay? In order to figure out the loss, I first have to figure out how much Canadian currency. And you don't have to use X. I can say Y. Maybe I'll use Y because I used X in the previous example. So Y is going to equal the amount of Canadian dollars. This time I'm going to go 1 over which rate, buying or selling? If I'm selling the foreign currency, what's the bank doing? They are buying. It's going to equal the foreign amount over the Canadian amount. Where do I get the buying rate from? Okay, the buying rate is right here. Says it right there, 0.1271. So I am going to write 0.127100 right there. It equals the foreign amount over the Canadian amount. I'm looking for the Canadian amount. Where do I put the Y? Numerator or denominator? In the denominator. What do I put up top for the foreign amount? Because there's really no number written here. Anyone know what it is? How much of the Chinese currency do I have right now in my wallet? 6,150.06. I'm trying to convert that back to, I'm trying to sell that back to the bank. So the bank's buying it from me. And I want to know how much Canadian dollars or how many Canadian dollars I would receive. Cross multiply. Y times 1 gives me Y. That's going to equal 615.06 times 0.1271. And I've got 780 $1.67. All right. Well, that's no good. I canceled my trip to China, and now I'm out a bunch of money. How much money did I start the day with? $1,000. How do I figure out the loss? I got to subtract. So to figure out the loss, in this case, I would take the $1,000 that I started with. I would subtract $781.67. And that's going to give me $218.33. Okay, so I'm out. The bank made $218.33 off me today. Banks will do that to you. Okay, I just want to point something out because some people, after a few days of doing this, they start to make these connections. They say anytime you have the foreign amount, we've used the buying rate. Okay, so I'll go back to our questions from yesterday, hopefully. There we go. Maybe not. Maybe it won't let me. No, it's because I'm filming on this one. But if you look at the examples from your notes from yesterday, you can see that anytime we had the foreign amount, we used the buying rate. And some people just say, oh, that's pretty easy. If you're looking for the Canadian amount, you just take your foreign amount and multiply it by the buying rate. Okay? And that would have worked up until this point. Okay? But you still have to think in terms of the bank's perspective. Because here's a question, all right? And it comes up in this situation, okay? Pause the video here for a second. All right, here's the situation. Sarah is purchasing a sweater online. The price of the sweater was $28.99 US. Okay, how much was charged to her credit card in Canadian dollars? So you're looking for the amount of Canadian. You know the amount of the foreign currency. You know it's $28.99 US dollars. So a lot of people think it should be like this last situation. If you know the foreign amount, you're looking for the Canadian, you use the buying rate. But think about this particular situation. You are actually buying an item in US dollars. Think of it like you're buying those US dollars. If you're buying, what's the bank doing? You actually have to use the selling rate. Okay? So this is a situation where I have the foreign amount, but I'm actually using the selling rate. And how do you recognize that? On your worksheet, look for the ones where you're dealing with online shopping. So I'll do the question the same way I always did. I'll say let X equal the amount of Canadian dollars. So what's being charged to her credit card? But this time, instead of going 1 over the buying rate, I'm saying 1 over the selling rate. And it's going to still equal the foreign amount over the Canadian amount. All right, where do I get this from? Where do I get the selling rate for the United States, US dollars? From what? The sheet I gave you yesterday, figure 1.2. So I have to go back to this page right here. I'm looking for the United States all the way to the bottom. Here it is. And I want the selling rate. Which one's the selling rate? Left column or right column? Selling rate is on the right. So I need to use this number right here, 1.038650. 1.038650. So I'll write that down again, 1.038650. So I have 1 over the selling rate. It's going to equal, what's the foreign amount? I know that. 28.99 US dollars. And I'm looking for the Canadian amount. So I'm putting an X down there. Cross multiply. One times X is X. 28.99 times 1.038650 gives me $30.11. Okay, costs you a lot more than that these days. And I would say she would be charged $30.11 Canadian with a capital C. That's what would show up on her credit card. So be careful, all right? Don't just assume if you're given the foreign amount looking for the Canadian that you have to use the buying rate. Always think from the bank's perspective. In all those other questions, I had foreign currency, but I was selling it back to the bank. That's why we use the buying rate. In this particular question, you're shopping online, You're actually buying something worth American dollars. You're buying American dollars, so the bank's selling. Everyone okay with that? All righty. That's where we'll stop today, and you can go to work on your sheet.